At the edge of a maintenance bay during the war, a mechanic crouched beside a fighter whose engines had only just gone silent. The pilot who had climbed out moments earlier was already walking away toward the briefing room, preparing for another patrol that most men in the unit privately believed he might not survive. Everyone understood the same uncomfortable truth. The aircraft was powerful, fast, and heavily armed. But against the enemy fighters it faced every day, power alone had not been enough. The fighter in question had been designed as a technological answer to many problems at once. Twin engines for reliability, long range for distant patrols, heavy weapons concentrated in the nose so a pilot could fire without worrying about gun convergence. On paper, the machine looked formidable. In tests, it could outrun most opponents and dive with frightening speed. Yet pilots returning from combat carried a different story. Speed helped them escape. It did not always help them win. Across the front lines, the opposing aircraft had earned a reputation that spread through briefing rooms and maintenance shops alike. Enemy pilots favored a fighter that behaved very differently in the air. It was lighter. It responded quickly to small control inputs. In a turning engagement, it could swing through the air with a tightness that made many Western aircraft struggle to keep up. Pilots learned quickly that if they tried to fight by turning horizontally with that opponent, they often lost. Official doctrine attempted to solve this problem with instructions rather than redesign. Pilots flying the twin-engine fighter were told to rely on altitude and speed, attack from above, strike once, then climb or dive away before the enemy could drag them into a turning contest. It was a disciplined system built around energy rather than maneuver. In theory, it kept the aircraft in the parts of the envelope where its advantages were strongest. But combat rarely followed theory perfectly. In practice, pilots found themselves pulled into turning engagements anyway. A sudden interception could collapse carefully planned formations. Clouds of fighters might break into smaller fights where survival depended on instinct rather than doctrine. And when that happened, the difference in turning performance became painfully obvious. The enemy aircraft could circle tighter. Pilots in the heavier machine often felt as though they were chasing a shadow that refused to stay in front of their guns. Maintenance crews heard the results of those encounters long before official reports circulated. Pilots climbed down from cockpits frustrated and exhausted, describing how the aircraft seemed to hesitate when they tried to tighten a turn. The control wheel would respond, but not immediately. There was a moment, a tiny delay, between the command and the aircraft's full reaction. In combat, even a fraction of a second felt enormous. At first, those complaints sounded like the normal tension of combat flying. Pilots under pressure often blamed machines for what might simply be the chaos of aerial combat, but the pattern kept repeating. Different pilots described the same hesitation. Different aircraft displayed the same behavior. The problem appeared subtle enough that it escaped formal diagnosis, yet persistent enough that mechanics began to hear about it almost every week. One mechanic, working long hours around the aircraft's control systems, started paying closer attention. His job required him to inspect the linkages that carried the pilot's movements from the cockpit to the control surfaces. Cables, pulleys, and hydraulic components all worked together to translate a small motion of the pilot's hands into a change in the aircraft's attitude. Normally, those systems were precise. Yet something about this particular fighter's arrangement bothered him. The more he examined it, the more he suspected that the issue did not lie in the aircraft's wings or engines at all. Instead, the delay seemed to originate inside the mechanism that controlled the flaps. These movable surfaces were designed to increase lift during takeoff and landing. In normal flight, they remained retracted, but the system controlling them was tied into other control elements in ways that created a subtle lag when the pilot demanded an aggressive maneuver. It was not a catastrophic flaw. The aircraft still flew. It still fought. But that small hesitation meant that when a pilot attempted a sudden tightening of a turn, the machine responded more slowly than expected. Against an opponent that already possessed a natural advantage in agility, that delay could determine whether a fighter moved inside its opponent's turning circle or remained stuck outside it. Officially, changing the aircraft's systems required approval through engineering channels. Such decisions involved paperwork, technical analysis, and command authorization. None of that moved quickly during wartime operations, where aircraft needed to remain available for missions every day. Mechanics were expected to maintain equipment exactly as specified, not experiment with modifications. Yet the mechanic who had noticed the problem could not forget the stories he kept hearing from pilots. He returned again to the linkage that governed the flaps. The more he studied it, the more he wondered whether the hesitation could be eliminated if those flaps responded instantly during tight turns. If they deployed slightly when the pilot pulled hard on the controls, they might increase lift just enough to help the aircraft tighten its arc. The concept was simple. The difficulty lay in making the system react automatically. The idea was not something he could propose easily through formal channels. Even suggesting such a change might have invited questions about authority. But in a maintenance environment, small improvisations sometimes happened quietly. A length of wire, properly routed, could change how two mechanical elements interacted. It could connect movement in one part of the system to another. One evening, while working inside the maintenance bay, the mechanic decided to try. He routed a small wire through the linkage that connected the control column to the flap mechanism. The adjustment was simple enough that it did not require major disassembly. When the pilot pulled hard on the controls during a tight maneuver, the wire would tug on the flap linkage just enough to drop the flaps, slightly. It was not a dramatic change, just enough to alter the aerodynamics at the exact moment the pilot needed extra lift. The installation took only minutes. The consequences were far less certain. No one knew whether the modification would help, harm, or simply do nothing at all. But the aircraft had a mission scheduled soon, and the mechanic had no formal test environment available. The only real evaluation would come in the air, during combat, under the same conditions where the hesitation had been noticed before. When the aircraft returned from its next patrol, something unusual happened. The pilot climbed down from the cockpit wearing an expression that mechanics recognized instantly: surprise mixed with excitement. During an engagement with enemy fighters, he had attempted a turn that normally would have felt sluggish. Instead, the aircraft had tightened far more quickly than expected. The response had been immediate. The fighter seemed to bite into the air and swing through the maneuver rather than drifting wide. In the confusion of aerial combat, that difference mattered. The pilot described how he had managed to keep the opposing aircraft inside his sights longer than usual. Instead of watching the enemy slip around the edge of his turning circle, he found himself staying closer to the target. The guns in the nose of the fighter, already one of its greatest strengths, suddenly had more opportunities to line up. At first, the mechanic listened quietly, unsure whether the change he had introduced had truly made the difference. Combat was unpredictable. A single engagement could produce misleading impressions. But as the aircraft flew more missions, the same pilot began repeating the observation. The fighter simply felt more responsive when turning hard. Other pilots noticed it too. Soon, a few more mechanics heard about the modification. The adjustment required nothing elaborate. A short wire, carefully installed, could connect the control input to the flap linkage. It did not require redesigning the aircraft or replacing major components. It simply allowed the flaps to assist the aircraft during tight turns instead of remaining completely inactive. The change spread quietly. Mechanics shared the idea with trusted colleagues. Another aircraft received the modification, then another. Pilots began reporting similar experiences during engagements. The fighter still relied on speed and altitude for its primary tactics, just as doctrine required. But when circumstances forced a turning fight, the aircraft no longer seemed as helpless as before. Word traveled informally through maintenance crews and flight lines. No official directive ordered the change. Instead, it passed from mechanic to mechanic, from squadron to squadron, carried by conversations beside aircraft waiting for their next mission. Each installation followed the same simple principle. Allow the flaps to deploy slightly when the pilot demanded the tightest maneuver. Over time, pilots flying the twin-engine fighter began to approach engagements with a different confidence. They still respected the opponent's agility. No one believed the aircraft had suddenly become the most maneuverable fighter in the sky. But the gap had narrowed. When pilots committed to a turn, the aircraft answered faster. The delay that once frustrated them seemed to disappear, and that change altered the geometry of dogfights in subtle but important ways. Reports from combat gradually reflected the shift. Pilots described situations where they had managed to stay inside an opponent's maneuver longer than expected. Opportunities for firing passes increased. Enemy fighters that once seemed untouchable during tight turns became targets that could occasionally be tracked through the arc of a maneuver. None of those outcomes could be traced easily to a single cause in official documentation. Combat results always reflected many factors: pilot skill, timing, positioning, and luck among them. Yet within the maintenance community, the explanation was quietly understood. A small mechanical adjustment had changed how the aircraft behaved at the most critical moment of a dogfight. Eventually, the concept behind the modification reached engineers and commanders who recognized its practical value. What had begun as an unofficial improvisation started appearing in more formal discussions about improving maneuver performance. The idea itself was not complex, but its impact came from recognizing exactly where a small intervention could reshape a larger system. By then, the mechanic who first experimented with the wire had already moved on to the endless rhythm of wartime maintenance. Aircraft continued arriving for inspection. Engines needed servicing. Control cables required adjustment. The work rarely paused long enough for recognition ceremonies or official credit. Yet the aircraft themselves carried the legacy of that quiet decision. In the air, during moments when a pilot pulled the controls sharply and the fighter responded instantly, the effect was still there. A small change inside a mechanical linkage allowed the machine to tighten its arc just enough to alter the outcome of a fight. The difference between drifting wide and cutting inside a turn could be measured in fractions of a second. Sometimes the history of wartime innovation is written through large programs, official designs, and famous engineers. But other times it begins in places like a maintenance bay, where someone notices a pattern others have overlooked and decides to test an idea with whatever tools are available. The mechanic who threaded that wire probably understood that better than anyone. He did not redesign the aircraft. He did not command a squadron or lead a research laboratory. Instead, he solved a problem that pilots had been struggling to explain. The solution was small, improvised, and almost invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. But once the aircraft lifted off and entered combat, the result spoke for itself.